10 Nights Dreams. Natsume Soseki. First night. I had this dream that I was sitting at the head of my bed, arms crossed, when a woman lying on her back said in a quiet voice, "I'm going to die now." Her long hair fanned out on the pillow, framing her delicate, oval face. A healthy flush colored her pale cheeks, and her lips were, of course, red. She didn't look like she was about to die at all. Yet, in a calm voice, she clearly stated, "I'm going to die now." I, too, was certain she would die. So, leaning over her, I asked, "Is that so? Are you really going to die?" "Yes, I am," she replied, opening her eyes wide. They were large and moist, and framed by long lashes, but their depths were utterly black. Reflected vividly in those black pupils was my own image. Gazing into the lustrous depths of her eyes, so clear they seemed to see right through me, I thought, can she really be dying? I brought my face close to the pillow beside hers and asked again, "You're not really dying, are you? You'll be all right, won't you?" Without changing her sleepy, half-closed eyes, she answered in the same quiet voice, "But I am dying. There's nothing I can do about it." "So, can you see my face?" I asked intently. "See your face?" "Well, it's reflected right there, isn't it?" she said with a gentle smile. Silently, I pulled my face away from the pillow. Arms crossed, I wondered if she truly was going to die. After a while, she spoke again. "When I die, bury me. Dig my grave with a large pearl oyster shell. Mark my grave with a fragment of a fallen star. And wait beside my grave. I will come back to see you." "When will you come back?" I asked. "The sun will rise," she said. "Then it will set. Then it will rise again, and then it will set again. While the red sun falls from east to west, can you wait?" I nodded silently. Raising her voice slightly, she declared, "Wait for 100 years. Wait for 100 years, sitting by my grave. I will surely come back to you." I simply replied that I would wait. Then, the image of myself, reflected so clearly in her black pupils, began to blur. It seemed to dissolve like a reflection disturbed by ripples in still water. And as the image flowed away, her eyes closed. Tears trickled down her cheeks from beneath her long lashes. She was dead. I went down to the garden and dug a hole with a pearl oyster shell. It was a large shell with a smooth, sharp edge. Each time I scooped up earth, the moonlight glinted off the inside of the shell. The damp smell of earth rose around me. Soon the hole was dug. I placed the woman inside and gently covered her with soft earth. With each handful, the moonlight glinted off the inside of the shell. Then I found a fallen star fragment and placed it lightly on the earth. It was round. I thought its edges must have been worn smooth from its long fall through the sky. As I lifted it and placed it on the ground, my chest and hands grew slightly warm. I sat down on the moss. Thinking, so, I'll be waiting here for 100 years, I crossed my arms and gazed at the round grave marker. Then, just as she had said, the sun rose in the east. It was a large, red sun. And just as she had said, it eventually set in the west. It sank, still red. 1, I counted. After a while, the crimson sun slowly rose again. Then it silently sank. 2, I counted again. As I continued counting in this way, 1, 2, I lost track of how many red suns had passed overhead. No matter how many times I counted, I couldn't count them all. Still, the 100 years hadn't passed. Finally, looking at the moss-covered, round stone, I began to wonder if the woman had tricked me. Then, a green stem sprouted from beneath the stone, angled towards me. It grew rapidly, stopping just at my chest. A long, slender bud at the tip of the gently swaying stem swelled and opened its petals. A pure white lily bloomed right in front of me, its fragrance so strong it pierced me to the bone. A drop of dew fell from far above, causing the flower to sway under its weight. I leaned forward and kissed the white petals, cold with dew. As I lifted my face from the lily, I happened to glance at the distant sky. A single morning star twinkled. The 100 years have already passed, I realized for the first time. Second night. I had this dream. Leaving the priest's room, I walked down the corridor back to my own. A paper lantern glowed dimly inside. As I knelt on a cushion and adjusted the wick, a clove, shaped like a flower, fell onto the red lacquered stand. At the same time, The room suddenly brightened. The painting on the sliding door was by Busan. Black willows, painted in varying shades to create depth, stood along a riverbank, and a chiller-looking fisherman walked along the embankment, his hat pulled low. On the alcove wall hung a scroll of Manju Bodhisattva emerging from the sea. The lingering scent of incense smoldered in the dimness. It was a large temple, silent and deserted. The round shadow of the paper lantern on the dark ceiling seemed to come alive as I looked up. Still kneeling, I lifted the cushion with my left hand and reached underneath with my right. It was right where I expected. Relieved, I replaced the cushion and sat down heavily. "You are a samurai," the priest had said. "A samurai should be able to attain enlightenment." He went on to say that if I couldn't attain enlightenment, then I wasn't a true samurai. He called me human scum. "Aha, I've angered you," he said, laughing. "If you're so offended, bring me proof of your enlightenment," he said, turning away dismissively. Damn him, before the clock in the next room struck the hour, I would attain enlightenment. I would return to his room tonight, enlightened, and exchange my enlightenment for his head. If I failed to attain enlightenment, I couldn't take his life. I absolutely had to attain enlightenment. I was a samurai. If I failed, I would commit seppuku. A disgraced samurai could not live. I would die a clean death. As I thought this, my hand involuntarily reached under the cushion again and pulled out the short sword with the red scabbard. Gripping the hilt tightly, I flicked the scabbard aside, and the cold blade flashed in the dim room. I felt something formidable escape from my hand, flowing towards the tip of the blade, concentrating its killing intent into a single point. Seeing the sharp blade, cruelly constrained to the size of a pinhead, yet inevitably sharpened to a 9.5-inch point, I was suddenly seized by the urge to plunge it into myself. Blood rushed to my wrist, making the hilt sticky. My lips trembled. I sheathed the sword, tucked it into my side, and assumed the lotus position. "Joshu says moo," I muttered. "What is moo?" "Damn priest," I cursed, clenching my teeth. I breathed heavily through my nose. My temples throbbed. I widened my eyes. I could see the hanging scroll. The lantern. The tatami mats. The priest's kettle-shaped head was vivid in my mind. I could even hear him sneering. Damn priest. I had to get my hands on that kettle head of his. I would attain enlightenment. "Moo, moo," I chanted under my breath. Even as I chanted moo, I could still smell the incense. Damn incense. I suddenly slammed my fist against my head, biting down hard on my teeth. Sweat poured from my armpits. My back was rigid. The joints in my knees ached sharply. What did it matter if my knees broke? But it hurt. It was agonizing. Moo wouldn't come. Just when I thought it would, the pain returned. I was furious. Frustrated. Deeply ashamed. Tears streamed down my face. I wanted to hurl myself against a giant rock and shatter my bones and flesh. Still, I endured, sitting motionless, suppressing the unbearable anguish that filled my chest. It pressed against my muscles, trying to escape through every pore, but finding no outlet in this utterly cruel predicament. Then my mind began to wander. The lantern, Busan's painting, the tatami mats, the staggered shelves, it was as if they both existed and didn't exist. Still, Moo remained elusive. I just sat there, half-conscious. Suddenly, the clock in the next room began to chime. I snapped to attention, my hand instinctively reaching for the sword. The clock chimed a second time. Third night. I had this dream. I was carrying a child of about 6 on my back. He was definitely my son. But strangely, he was blind, his eyes vacant. When I asked him, "When did your eyes go blind?" he replied, "Since forever." His voice was definitely a child's, but his speech was like an adult's. And he spoke to me as an equal. Green rice paddies stretched out on either side of us. The path was narrow. Occasionally, the shadow of a heron crossed our path. "We've reached the rice paddies," he said from my back. "How do you know?" I asked, turning my head back as far as I could. "Because the heron is crying," he replied. Sure enough, a heron cried out twice. I started to feel uneasy about the child on my back. I didn't know what would become of us. Looking ahead for a place to abandon him, I saw a large forest in the darkness. As I began to consider it, he chuckled from behind me. "What are you laughing at?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Father, am I heavy?" "You're not heavy," I replied. "I will be soon," he said. I walked silently towards the forest. The path through the rice paddies wound irregularly, making it difficult to progress. Soon it forked. I stopped at the fork to rest. "There should be a stone here," the boy said. Indeed, there was an 8-inch square stone standing about waist high. On its face, I could make out the red inscription, "Left to Hikubo, right to Hotahara." I could clearly see the red characters even in the darkness. The red was the color of a newt's belly. "Left is better," the boy instructed. To the left, I saw the forest, casting its dark shadow from the high sky down upon us. I hesitated. "Don't hold back," the boy said again. I had no choice but to walk towards the forest. How does a blind boy know all this? I wondered as I walked. As we approached the forest along the single path, he said from my back, "It's really inconvenient being blind, you know." "That's why I'm carrying you," I said. "I appreciate you carrying me, but it's awful being treated like a fool. Especially being treated like a fool by your own parent." I felt a surge of annoyance. I just wanted to get to the forest, abandon him, and be done with it. "You'll understand soon. It was a night just like this," he muttered as if to himself. "What?" I asked sharply. "What?" "You know what," he replied mockingly. I began to feel as though I did know. But I couldn't quite grasp it. It just felt like I had been here before, on a night like this. And I felt that if I kept going, I would remember. But I knew that remembering would be terrible, so I had to abandon him quickly before I remembered, so I could be at peace. I quickened my pace. It had started to rain. The path grew darker. I was almost in a trance. The small boy clung to my back, a mirror reflecting my past, present, and future, revealing every detail. And he was my son. And he was blind. I felt overwhelmed. "Here, here. Right at the base of that cedar tree." The boy's voice was clear in the rain. I stopped involuntarily. We had entered the forest without me realizing it. The dark shape about 6 feet ahead did indeed look like a cedar tree. "Father, it was at the base of that cedar tree, wasn't it?" "Yes, that's right," I replied without thinking. "In the year of the dragon, 1822, wasn't it?" It did seem like the year of the dragon, 1822. "It was exactly 100 years ago tonight that you killed me." As soon as I heard these words, the realization struck me. On a dark, rainy night like this, 100 years ago, in the year of the dragon, 1822, at the base of this cedar tree, I had killed a blind man. The moment I realized I was a murderer, the child on my back suddenly became as heavy as a stone Jizo statue. Fourth night. I had this dream. I in the middle of a large earthen-floored room sat a raised platform like a cooling platform, surrounded by small stools. The platform gleamed darkly. In one corner, an old man sat alone at a small, square table, drinking sake. His side dish seemed to be some kind of nemono. The old man's face was flushed from the sake. His skin was smooth and wrinkle-free. Only his long, white beard indicated his age. Even as a child, I wondered how old he was. A woman, presumably his wife, came in from the back, a bucket of water in her hand, which she had drawn from the bamboo pipe. Wiping her hands on her apron, she asked, "How old are you?" The old man swallowed the nemono he had been chewing and said calmly, "I've forgotten." The woman stood watching him from the side, hands tucked into her narrow sash. The old man took a large gulp of sake from a bowl-like cup and blew out a long breath through his white beard. Then the woman asked, "Where are you from?" Interrupting his long exhale, the old man replied, "From the depths of my navel." With her hands still tucked into her sash, she asked, "Where are you going?" The old man took another gulp of hot sake from the large cup, blew out another long breath, and said, "That way." "Straight ahead?" the woman asked. As she spoke, the old man's exhaled breath seemed to pass through the paper sliding doors, under the willow tree, and towards the riverbank. The old man went outside. I followed. A small gourd hung from his waist. A square box was slung over his shoulder, tucked under his arm. He wore light yellow trousers and a light yellow sleeveless jacket. Only his tabi socks were yellow. They looked like they were made of leather. The old man walked straight to the willow tree. 3 or 4 children were playing underneath it. Smiling, he pulled a light yellow hand towel from his waist and twisted it tightly like a rope. He placed it on the ground and drew a large circle around it. Finally, he pulled a brass toy flute, the kind used by candy vendors, from the box on his shoulder. Watch closely, he repeated. This hand towel will turn into a snake. The children stared intently at the hand towel. I stared too. Watch closely, all right, he said, blowing on the flute and circling the hand towel. I kept my eyes fixed on the towel, but it didn't move. The old man continued to toot on the flute, circling the towel over and over. He moved cautiously, as if tiptoeing around the towel, or afraid of it. He looked both scary and comical. Finally, he stopped playing the flute. He opened the box on his shoulder, picked up the end of the hand towel, and tossed it inside. If I leave it like this, it will turn into a snake in the box. I'll show you later, he said, and started walking. He passed under the willow tree and walked straight down the narrow path. I wanted to see the snake, so I followed him. The old man kept walking, saying, "It'll happen soon, and it'll turn into a snake." Eventually, he started singing. "It'll happen soon, a snake it'll be. Surely it will be, the flute will play its decree." He finally reached the riverbank. There was no bridge, no boat. I thought he would stop here and show us the snake in the box. But he just waded into the river. The water was knee-deep at first, but it gradually rose to his waist, then his chest, until he was almost submerged. Still, he kept singing. Deeper it gets, night descends its shroud. Straighter it becomes, beneath the starry cloud. He continued walking straight ahead until his beard, his face, his head, his hood, everything disappeared from view. I stood among the rustling reeds, waiting for him to reach the other side and show us the snake. But he never came back. 5th night. I had this dream. It was a very long time ago, seemingly close to the age of the gods. I had been fighting in a war and, unfortunately, was defeated and captured. I was brought before the enemy general. People were tall back then, and they all had long beards. They wore leather belts from which they hung straight, rod-like swords. Their bows looked like thick, unlacquered, unpolished wisteria vines. Everything was very primitive. The enemy general was sitting on an upturned sake jar, a bow stuck upright in the ground beside him, its center gripped in his right hand. His eyebrows were thick and met above his nose. Of course, razors didn't exist back then. As a captive, I wasn't allowed to sit. I sat cross-legged on the grass. I was wearing large straw sandals. Straw sandals were deep in those days, reaching almost to my knees when I stood. The edges were left unwoven, creating tassels that swayed as I walked. The general looked at me in the firelight and asked, "Do you choose to live or die?" This was the custom back then. All captives were asked this question. To answer live meant surrender. To answer die meant defiance. I answered die without hesitation. The general threw his bow aside and began to draw his rod-like sword. Just then, a gust of wind blew the flickering firelight towards him. I raised my right hand, palm open like a maple leaf, towards the general, holding it above my eyes. It was a signal to wait. The general sheathed his thick sword with a clang. Even in those days, there was love. I said I wanted to see the woman I loved one last time before I died. The general said he would wait until daybreak, until the rooster crowed. I had to get her here before then. If she didn't arrive by the time the rooster crowed, I would be killed without seeing her. The general sat watching the fire. I sat cross-legged in my large straw sandals, waiting for the woman. The night deepened. From time to time, the fire would collapse, sending a flurry of flames towards the general. The general's eyes glittered beneath his dark, joined eyebrows. Someone came and threw more branches onto the fire. Soon, the fire crackled and popped, a defiant sound against the darkness. At that moment, the woman led a white horse from where it was tethered to an oak tree. She stroked its mane 3 times and leaped onto its bare back. There was no saddle, no stirrups. Kicking the horse's flanks with her slender legs, she set off at a gallop. Someone added more wood to the fire, and the distant sky grew faintly lighter. The horse flew through the darkness towards this light, 2 plumes of breath, like pillars of fire, streaming from its nostrils. Still, the woman relentlessly kicked its flanks. The horse galloped so fast that its hooves seemed to clang in midair. The woman's hair streamed behind her like a banner in the darkness. But she was still far from the fire. Suddenly, from the darkness beside the path, came the crow of a rooster. The woman leaned back, pulling hard on the reins. The horse's front hooves struck the hard rock. The rooster crowed again with a cry. The woman released the reins. The horse stumbled, pitching forward with its rider. Below the rock was a deep chasm. The hoofprints are still there on the rock. It was an amanjaku, a mischievous mountain spirit, that mimicked the rooster's crow. As long as those hoofprints are etched in the rock, the amanjaku is my enemy. Sixth night. I had this dream, hearing that Unkei was carving the Neo-Guardian statues at the main gate of Gokokuji Temple. I went for a stroll to see for myself. A large crowd had already gathered, busily offering their opinions. A large red pine stood about 15 feet in front of the gate, its trunk leaning diagonally, obscuring the tiled roof of the gate and reaching up into the distant blue sky. The green of the pine and the vermilion of the gate complemented each other beautifully. And the position of the pine was perfect. It gracefully framed the left side of the gate, its branches spreading wider as they reached upward, overhanging the roof in a way that seemed ancient, reminiscent of the Kamakura period. Everyone watching was, like myself, from the Meiji era. There were many rickshaw men among them, probably killing time while waiting for fares. "That's massive," one said. "Must be harder work than making a human," said another. Then someone else said, Neo statues. They're still carving Neo statues these days? I thought they were all ancient. They look powerful, don't they? That's what I've always heard. They say nobody's stronger than a Neo statue. Even stronger than Yamato Takeru, apparently, said another man, squatting with his hari jacket hiked up, and no hat. He seemed rather uneducated. Unkei paid no attention to the onlookers' comments, continuing to work his chisel and mallet. He didn't even glance their way. Perched high up, he diligently carved the Neo's face. Unkei wore a small, ebosha-like hat and a loose robe of some sort, its large sleeves tied behind his back. His appearance was distinctly old-fashioned, completely out of place among the chattering crowd. I wondered how Unkei could still be alive in this day and age. Strange things happen, I mused as I continued to watch. Unkei, however, seemed to find nothing strange or unusual about his situation, focusing intently on his carving. A young man who had been watching him with his head tilted back turned to me and said, "He's truly impressive, isn't he? He doesn't even acknowledge our presence. He's completely absorbed in his work, as if only he and the Neo exist. Magnificent." I found his comment interesting. As I glanced at the young man, he continued, "Just look at the way he handles the chisel and mallet. He's reached a state of perfect mastery." Unkei carved a thick eyebrow an inch horizontally, then flipped the chisel vertically and brought the mallet down diagonally. He chipped away at the hard wood with each blow, thick shavings flying with every clang. In an instant, the flared side of the angrily upturned nose emerged. His chisel strokes were bold and unhesitating, devoid of any doubt. It's amazing how he can use the chisel so casually and create exactly the eyebrow and nose he wants, I murmured in admiration. The young man replied, "Oh, he's not creating the eyebrow and nose with the chisel. The eyebrow and nose are already there, buried within the wood. He's simply revealing them with the chisel and mallet. It's like digging a stone out of the ground. There's no way he can make a mistake." It was then that I understood what sculpture was all about. If that was the case, it seemed like anyone could do it. Suddenly, I felt the urge to carve a Neo myself, so I left the crowd and headed home. I took a chisel and mallet from my toolbox and went out back. There was a pile of oak logs that had been felled by a recent storm, ready to be cut into firewood. I chose the largest log and began carving enthusiastically, but unfortunately, I didn't find a Neo. I tried the next one, but with no luck. The third log also contained no Neo. I carved every single log in the pile, but none of them held a Neo. Finally, I realized that Neo statues simply weren't buried inside Meiji-era wood. And I think I finally understood why Unkei was still alive today. Seventh night. I had this dream. I was on a large ship. Day and night, without ceasing, the ship belched black smoke and plowed through the waves. The noise was tremendous. But I didn't know where we were going. A firebrand-like sun would rise from the depths of the waves. It would climb to the top of the tall mast and hang there for a while before overtaking the ship and sailing ahead. Finally, it would sizzle and sink back into the waves like a dying ember. Each time, the blue waves in the distance churned with crimson. The ship, with its tremendous noise, would chase after the sun, but it could never catch it. One day, I grabbed one of the sailors and asked, "Is this ship going west?" The sailor looked at me strangely for a moment and then asked, "Why?" "Because it seems to be chasing the setting sun." The sailor laughed and walked away. Does the western sun set in the east? Is it true? Does the eastern sun rise in the west? Is that true, too? My body is adrift on the waves. At the helm, we drift. Drift on, a voice chanted. I went to the bow and saw a group of sailors hauling on thick ropes. I felt terribly uneasy. I didn't know when we would reach land, or where we were going. All I knew was that we were churning through the waves, belching black smoke. The waves were vast, stretching endlessly, blue, sometimes purple. Only around the ship were they constantly white with foam. I felt so uneasy that I considered throwing myself into the sea. There were many other passengers, mostly foreigners, with all sorts of faces. When the sky clouded over and the ship rocked, a woman leaned against the railing and wept. The handkerchief she used to wipe her eyes was white, but she wore a brightly colored, patterned dress. Seeing her, I realized I wasn't the only one who was sad. One night, I was on deck, gazing at the stars, when a foreigner approached me and asked if I knew anything about astronomy. I was so miserable I was contemplating suicide. I had no need for astronomy. I remained silent. The foreigner then told me about the Pleiades in the constellation Taurus. He said that the stars and the sea were all created by God. Finally, he asked if I believed in God. I looked up at the sky and remained silent. One time, I entered the salon and saw a young woman in a flamboyant dress playing the piano with her back to me. A tall, handsome man stood beside her, singing. His mouth looked enormous. They seemed completely oblivious to everything but each other, even forgetting they were on a ship. I grew even more despondent. I finally decided to end it all. One night, when no one was around, I jumped into the sea. But, the moment my feet left the deck and I broke my connection with the ship, I suddenly regretted it. I wished with all my heart that I hadn't jumped. But it was too late. I was falling into the sea whether I liked it or not. The ship must have been very high, because even though I had left the deck, my feet were still far from the water. But with nothing to hold on to, I drew closer and closer to the water. No matter how much I tucked my legs up, I kept falling. The water was black. The ship, still belching black smoke, sailed past. Even though I didn't know where it was going, I realized I would have been better off staying on board. But I couldn't make use of this realization. Filled with infinite regret and terror, I silently sank into the black waves. 8th night. I had this dreamed as I stepped over the threshold of the barber shop. 3 or 4 people in white uniforms greeted me in unison, "Welcome." Standing in the center of the room, I looked around. It was a square room with windows on 2 sides and mirrors on the other 2. I counted 6 mirrors. I sat down in front of one of the mirrors. The chair was surprisingly comfortable. My face was clearly reflected in the mirror. Behind me, I could see the window, and diagonally, the cashier's counter. No one was at the counter. I could see the upper halves of people passing by outside. Shotaro walked by with a woman. He was wearing a new Panama hat. I wondered where the woman had come from. They both looked pleased with themselves. I tried to get a good look at her face, but they passed by too quickly. A tofu vendor passed by, blowing a horn. His cheeks puffed out like he'd been stung by a bee. He disappeared with his cheeks still puffed out, leaving me feeling strangely concerned, as if he would remain that way forever. A geisha walked by. She wasn't wearing makeup yet. Her shimoda hairstyle was coming loose, and her face looked sleepy and pale. I bowed and tried to say something, but she never appeared in the mirror. A large man in a white uniform came up behind me with scissors and a comb and began examining my hair. I twisted my thin mustache and asked him, "What do you think? Will it amount to anything?" Without a word, he lightly tapped my head with the amber comb. "Well, what about my head? Do you think it will amount to anything?" I asked him. He still didn't answer, just started snipping with his scissors. I tried to watch every movement reflected in the mirror, but the black hairs kept flying towards me, so I closed my eyes. Then the barber said, "Have you seen the goldfish seller outside?" I said I hadn't. He didn't say anything more and continued snipping. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Look out!" I opened my eyes and saw the wheel of a bicycle and the shaft of a rickshaw beneath the barber's arm. Then he pushed my head to the side, and the bicycle and rickshaw disappeared. The scissors snipped away, the barber moved to my side and began trimming around my ears. Since the hairs weren't flying towards me anymore, I opened my eyes. I heard the rhythmic pounding of mochi being made, accompanied by the calls, "Our mochi, mochi, mochi." I remembered seeing a mochi maker as a child and wanted to see it again, but the mochi maker never appeared in the mirror. Only the pounding continued. Straining my eyes, I peered into the corner of the mirror. A woman was now sitting at the cashier's counter. She was a large woman with dark skin and thick eyebrows. Her hair was styled in an ikogeshi, and she wore a plain, unlined kimono with a black satin haneri collar. Kneeling, she was busily counting banknotes. They looked like 10-yen notes. With her long eyelashes lowered and her thin lips pursed, she counted intently, remarkably fast. There seemed to be an endless supply of banknotes. She had perhaps 100 notes on her lap, but no matter how long she counted, there were always 100 notes. I stared blankly at the woman's face and the 10-yen notes. Then the barber said loudly beside my ear, "Let's rinse that off." It seemed like a good time to leave, so I stood up and glanced back at the cashier's counter. But the woman, the banknotes, everything was gone. I paid and went outside. To the left of the entrance, 5 small tubs were lined up, filled with red goldfish, mottled goldfish, thin goldfish, fat goldfish. The goldfish seller sat behind them, chin resting on her hand, gazing at the fish. She seemed oblivious to the bustling street. I stood there for a while, watching her. But she didn't move a muscle. 9th night. I had this dream. A sense of unease filled the air. It felt like war was imminent. Like a spooked, riderless horse galloping endlessly around a mansion, pursued relentlessly by a swarm of foot soldiers. Yet, inside the house, all was quiet. Inside were a young mother and her 3-year-old child. The father was gone. He had left in the middle of a moonless night. He had put on his straw sandals and a dark hood on the veranda and slipped out through the back door. The light from the paper lantern the mother held had stretched out into the darkness, illuminating an old cypress tree near the hedge. The father never returned. Every day, the mother asked her 3-year-old, "Where is your father?" The child didn't answer at first. After a while, he started responding, "Over there." When the mother asked, "When will he come home?" he still replied, "Over there," and laughed. Then the mother would laugh too, and repeat over and over, "He'll be home soon." But the child only learned the word soon. Sometimes, when asked, "Where is your father?" he would reply, "Soon." At night, when everything was quiet, the mother would tighten her sash, tuck a short sword with a sharkskin scabbard into it, strap her child to her back with a narrow sash, and slip out of the house. She always wore zori sandals. The child would often fall asleep on her back, lulled by the sound of her footsteps. She walked west through the residential streets lined with earthen walls, down a gentle slope. At the bottom stood a large ginkgo tree. Using the ginkgo tree as a landmark, she turned right. About a quarter of a mile further on, through fields and bamboo grass, stood a stone torii gate. Passing through the gate, she entered a dark cedar grove. Following a stone path for about 60 feet, she reached the steps of an old shrine. A grey offertory box sat at the top, a thick rope hanging from a large bell above it. During the day, a plaque next to the bell read Hashiman Shrine. The character 48 was written in a distinctive style, resembling 2 doves facing each other. There were other plaques as well, mostly dedicated to successful target practice by members of the household, listing their names alongside the targets they had hit. Occasionally, there were dedications of swords. An owl always hooted in the cedar trees beyond the torii gate. The rhythmic slap of the mother's zori sandals echoed through the grove. When she reached the shrine, she rang the bell and then knelt and clapped her hands. The owl usually stopped hooting then. The mother fervently prayed for her husband's safe return. She believed that since her husband was a samurai, if she prayed earnestly to Hashiman, the god of archery and war, Her prayer would surely be answered sometimes. The child would wake up at the sound of the bell. Seeing the darkness, he would start crying on his mother's back. While continuing her prayer, she would try to soothe him by rocking back and forth. Sometimes he would quiet down, other times he would cry even louder. Either way, the mother wouldn't stand up after praying for her husband. She would untie the sash, bring the child around to the front, and hold him in her arms. "Be a good boy and wait here for a little while," she would whisper, pressing her cheek against his. Then she would lengthen the sash, tie the child to the railing of the shrine, and go back down the steps to perform the hyakudo, walking back and forth along the 60-foot stone path 100 times tied to the shrine. The child would crawl around the veranda as far as the sash allowed. These were the easier nights for the mother. But if the child cried, she would be frantic, her pacing quickening, her breath coming in gasps. If it became unbearable, she would interrupt her hyakudo, go back up to the shrine, comfort the child, and then resume her walking night after night. The mother worried and prayed, sacrificing sleep for her husband's safety. But her husband had already been killed by Ronin long ago. I heard this sad story from the mother in my dream 10th night. I had this dream. Ken came to tell me that Shotaro had returned after 7 nights, having been abducted by a woman, and had immediately fallen ill with a high fever. Shotaro was the most handsome man in town, and a thoroughly kind and honest person. He had only one eccentricity: he liked to wear his Panama hat and sit in front of the confectionery shop in the evenings, watching the women go by and admiring them. Other than that, he was unremarkable. When there weren't many women passing by, he would admire the confections instead. There were all sorts of sweets: peaches, apples, loquats, bananas, beautifully arranged in baskets and displayed in 2 rows, ready to be purchased as gifts. Shotaro would look at the baskets and declare them beautiful. He would say that if he were to go into business, he would open a confectionery shop. Yet, he continued to stroll around in his Panama hat, doing nothing. He would sometimes critique the fruits, saying things like, "That color is lovely," pointing at a summer orange. But he never actually bought any. He wouldn't eat them without paying, of course. He just admired their appearance. One evening, a woman suddenly stopped in front of the shop. She seemed to be a woman of high standing, judging by her elegant attire. Shotaro was captivated by the color of her kimono and her beauty. He took off his precious Panama hat and greeted her politely. The woman pointed to the largest basket of fruit and said, "I'll take this one." Shotaro immediately picked up the basket and handed it to her. The woman lifted it and remarked on its weight. Shotaro, being a man of leisure and exceedingly obliging, offered to carry it home for her. They left the confectionery shop together, and he never returned. Even for Shotaro, this is too carefree. Something must be amiss, his relatives and friends worried. Then, on the 7th night, he suddenly reappeared. Everyone crowded around him, asking, "Shotaro, where have you been?" He replied that he had taken a train to the mountains. It must have been a very long train ride. According to Shotaro, when he got off the train, he found himself in a vast field of green grass. He and the woman walked through the grass until they suddenly reached the edge of a cliff. The woman told him to jump. He looked down but couldn't see the bottom. He took off his Panama hat and politely refused. Then the woman said, "If you don't jump, you'll be licked by pigs. Is that all right with you?" Shotaro hated pigs more than anything. But he valued his life more, so he still hesitated. Just then, a pig appeared, snorting. Shotaro struck the pig's snout with his thin, beetle palm walking stick. The pig squealed and tumbled backward down the cliff. Shotaro sighed in relief. Then another pig appeared, rubbing its large snout against him. He reluctantly raised his walking stick again. The pig squealed and plummeted to the bottom of the chasm. Then another pig appeared. Suddenly, Shotaro realized what was happening. He looked up and saw an endless horde of pigs, thousands, perhaps millions, charging towards him from the far end of the green field, snorting. Shotaro was terrified. But he had no choice. He diligently struck the snout of each approaching pig with his beetle palm walking stick. Strangely, every pig he touched tumbled down the cliff. Looking down, he saw a seemingly bottomless chasm filled with falling pigs. The sight of so many pigs falling, pigs he had sent to their doom, frightened him. But the pigs kept coming, like a black cloud with legs, Trampling the green grass, an endless stream of snorting pigs, Shotaro desperately fought off the pigs for 7 days and 6 nights. But finally, he was exhausted, his arms weak as jelly. The pigs licked him, and he collapsed on the cliff's edge. Ken finished Shotaro's story and said, "See? It's not good to stare at women too much." I agreed. But Ken was really just hoping to get Shotaro's Panama hat. Shotaro probably won't survive. The Panama hat will likely be Ken's.